Okay, for next slide kita akan lihat kepada tentang another group of taxpayer, that's the employee. In an employment contract, saya rasa employee ada diberi tawaran perks or benefit, whether sama ada dalam bentuk cash or non-monetary form. So example yang boleh diberi, contoh perks yang ada macam electricity bill or telephone bill, club or gym membership, professional subscription, juga kalau kata melibatkan claim allowance, contohnya macam travel allowance, petrol, parking, tolls atau meals lah. Okay, so benda ni employee also sometimes required to make expenses on behalf of the employer. So for both scenarios, when the sales or transaction happen, employee is required to apply for e-invoice to be submitted to the employer as proof of expenses. Okay. However, not all transactions are invoice ready. Saya percaya sebab kita akan mandate pada Julai 2025 nanti. For the implementation of invoice, when a sale of transaction occurs, employees are required to apply for e-invoice to be submitted to the employer as a proof of expenses. To make it easier to the employer for this kind of expenses, lembaga asal allows employer to continue using e-invoice on behalf of employees to support expense transaction by the employer. And in cases where payment involve benefit to employees abroad, LHDN accept receipt bill invoice issued by overseas seller. In this situation, employer is allowed to submit a consolidated e-invoice. Hanya perkara ini terpakai sekiranya lah perks or benefit ini terkandung dalam employer policy lah. Okay. So next is self-bill invoice. Untuk treatment self-bill invoice ni ada 8 transaction yang dibenarkan untuk sekarang, iaitu dalam self-bill invoice ni buyer or other party akan mengambil peranan sebagai supplier and become the issuer of e-invoice lah. Okay. So the specific transaction for self-bill invoice ni yang pertamanya adalah payment to agent, dealer, distributor or related third parties, di mana buyers are required to issue invoice for payment made to agent or third parties. Keduanya adalah purchase of good or services from overseas seller, di mana Malaysian buyer yang beli perlu issue invoice on behalf of overseas sellers. Ketiganya adalah profit distribution, the taxpayer making the payment, issue an invoice on behalf of the profit distribution recipient. Keempatnya adalah e-commerce transaction. Kelimanya adalah payout to all betting and gaming winners. 6 adalah acquisition of goods or services from individual taxpayer not conducting business. 7 adalah payment and credit to taxpayer recorded in statement be issued on periodic basis. Sampai rebate. Ke-8nya adalah interest payment. Okay. In such scenario, kita the buyer assume the role of the seller and akan issue invoice and submit to LHDN for validation. So invoice ni akan jadikan sebagai bukti lah, sebagai proof of expenses for the buyer. So next slide is transaction which involve payment, whether in monetary form or otherwise, to agent, dealer or distributor. Okay, saya rasa perkara ni dah menjadi perkara biasa dalam perniagaan sekarang untuk lantik third party seperti agent, dealers or distributors, and akan bagi commission untuk atas servis yang diberi on behalf the seller lah. Okay. So dalam transaksi ini, the seller is required to issue an e-invoice to the buyer to document the transaction. Okay. Sekiranya e-invoice is not applicable, the seller can issue a standard receipt invoice to the buyer for transaction recording. Sama seperti yang kalau kata dia tak memerlukan atau buyer yang tidak memerlukan invoice, so the seller perlu membuat consolidated invoice untuk validation dan combine semua transaction ini within a month. So the same timeline as issuing a consolidated invoice within 7 days, 7 hari selepas bulan hadapannya itu. Okay. Sekiranya transaction occurrence, the third party become eligible to receive a commission payment from the supplier. The seller, assuming the role of the supplier, will issue a self-bill invoice to document expenses, that is commission payment to third party, and record income to the agent or third party as a commission. Okay. Next slide is a transaksi berkaitan cross-border and foreign income. So this transaction can be categorized into two types. First is import transaction. In the case of good or service sold by overseas seller to Malaysian buyer, that's mean import transaction, the overseas seller will issue an invoice, bill, receipt to the Malaysian buyer to document the transaction. Okay. Overseas seller are not obligated to comply with the e-invoice requirement under the Malaysian e-invoice implementation. The Malaysian buyer are required to issue e-invoice based on their bills, obtaining approval from custom for imported good. The buyer must input the relevant details as specified in the invoice attachment of the imported good. This invoice serves as crucial documentation for supporting transactions subject to taxation. Manakala untuk export transaction, the seller, that is a Malaysian seller, must issue an invoice to the overseas buyer to record the transaction. Okay, dalam konteks foreign income pula, for overseas income received in Malaysia, e-invoice must be issued as a proof of income, whereby the supplier is the entity receiving foreign income, referred to as income reception in this section, whereas the buyer is the individual or entity making the payment to the income reception, referred to as payer for clarity. The process of issuing invoice for foreign income mirrors that of Malaysian sellers issuing invoice to overseas buyers. Recipients of overseas income in Malaysia are required to issue an invoice latest by the end of the following month of receipt of the said foreign income in Malaysia. Next is profit distribution. In the current situation, companies typically distribute profit to shareholder using methods such as dividend warrants or dividend vouchers. Under invoice implementation, companies that do not meet the criteria for tax deduction outlined in Section 108 of the Income Tax Act and taxpayer listed on Bursa Malaysia are exempted from issuing invoice for self-bill related to dividend distribution. Consequently, shareholders are not obligated to generate e-invoice for the purpose of income verification. It's important to note that this exemption will be reviewed from time to time. Taxpayer falling under this exemption can adhere to their existing process for profit distribution, whereby the supplier is the recipient of the distribution, that is profit sharing recipient, whereas the buyer is the taxpayer responsible for making the distribution. However, for taxpayers not qualifying for the exemption, the issuance of self-billing invoice remains essential for recording expenses. Moreover, this self-billing invoice serves as proof of income for profit sharing recipient.